The stagecoach had been rolling for 3 days when Rowena Voss finally stopped trying to sleep. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape change outside the smudged window, the soft greens of the lowlands giving way to something harder, something wide and unforgiving and breathtakingly honest. The land out here did not pretend to be gentle. It simply was what it was, and there was a strange comfort in that. You could not be disappointed by a thing that had never offered you anything false. On the seat beside her, tucked between her hip and the wall of the coach, sat a wooden box, small enough to carry with one hand, heavy enough to mean something. It was locked with a brass clasp that had gone green at the edges from years of handling, and the wood itself was worn smooth along the corners where her fingers had gripped it 1,000 times before. Inside, a roll of clean linen bandage, 3 small brown bottles of tincture, each labeled in her own careful handwriting, a pair of scissors with handles wrapped in cord, a folding tool she had learned to use from a physician who never thanked her for the years she gave him. The box was not beautiful. It was not the kind of thing a woman packed when she was going somewhere hopeful. It was the kind of thing a woman packed when she was going somewhere necessary. Rowena was 33 years old, and she had learned the difference. The other passengers in the coach were a merchant who fell asleep with his chin on his chest, snoring in the even, reliable rhythm of a man with nothing troubling his sleep, and a young couple so absorbed in each other they had forgotten the rest of the world existed. Rowena watched the land instead. She watched the way the late afternoon light turned the dry grass to copper and the distant ridgeline to something almost purple, and she thought about the letter folded in her coat pocket. She did not take it out. She had read it often enough that she could have recited it word for word, including the parts that made her stomach tighten. The careful, formal language of a man who was better at managing land than managing words, who had written that he needed a capable woman to help run the household, who had mentioned his son exactly once in passing, as though the boy were a piece of furniture he had neglected to describe. His name was Cormac Bell. He lived on a ranch called Ashfield, somewhere beyond a town called Greystone Hollow. He had been a widower for nearly 4 years. That was what the letter said. What the letter did not say was everything Rowena had learned to listen for in the space between words, the things people left out because they did not know how to include them, or because including them would require admitting something they were not ready to admit. She pressed her temple against the cool glass of the window and let her eyes go soft and unfocused against the passing landscape. She was not going to Greystone Hollow because she believed in second chances. She was going because every other door had closed and this one was still open. And she was not the kind of woman who sat in a hallway when a door was open. She was the kind of woman who walked through. The coach rolled on. Greystone Hollow appeared first as a smudge of gray smoke against the early evening sky, then as a cluster of dark shapes along a flat stretch of land where the road widened and the wagon ruts deepened. By the time the coach pulled to a stop in front of a building with a painted sign swinging in the wind, the sun had dropped below the tree line, and the air had taken on that particular quality of autumn dusk. Cold at the edges, still carrying the memory of warmth at the center. Rowena was the last one off the coach. She stepped down carefully, holding her wooden box against her chest with one arm, and stood for a moment on the packed dirt of the main street while the merchant pushed past her and the young couple drifted away hand in hand. She looked at the town with the same quiet attention she had always given new environments, not searching for anything beautiful, just cataloging what was there. A general store with its window lamp already lit. A smithy with the fire banked down for evening. A church at the far end of the street, white painted, its single bell tower catching the last of the light. A gathering of men near the livery, not doing anything in particular, just standing the way men stand in small towns when they want to know who has arrived without appearing to want to know. They were looking at her. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the woman who stepped out of the boarding house just to her left, a stout woman in a gray apron, wiping her hands on a cloth, who looked at Rowena with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was something stranger than friendly. It was the expression of a person who already knew more about Rowena's situation than Rowena had told anyone. It was the expression of someone who felt sorry for her, and who had decided to keep that feeling to herself. The woman met Rowena's eyes, started to say something, then seemed to think better of it. She smiled instead, a careful, practiced smile, and went back inside. Rowena filed that away. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice. He did not call out her name or announce himself in any way. She heard the sound of boots on packed earth, deliberate and unhurried, and then he was simply there, standing at the edge of the light from the boarding house window. A tall man in a canvas work coat with a hat pulled low against the evening chill, and beside him, pressed close to his left leg as though attached, a boy. The boy was perhaps 9 years old. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes that were doing the same quiet cataloging that Rowena had just been doing, moving over her face, her clothing, her wooden box, the way she was standing. He was not hostile. He was not warm. He was simply watching, with the particular gravity of a child who has learned that new people in his life tend not to stay. The man said her name. Just that, her last name, the way men did when they were uncertain whether familiarity was appropriate, when they were keeping a careful distance they had decided on before she arrived. His voice was low and unhurried like the rest of him, not unkind. She said his name back, Cormac Bell. It felt formal in her mouth. That was all right. Formal was a starting place. He took her larger bag without asking. He did not take the wooden box. Whether that was because he had not noticed it, or because he instinctively understood it was not the kind of thing you took from someone without permission, she could not yet say. He walked ahead to where a wagon waited, and Rowena followed, and the boy walked between them without speaking. The drive to Ashfield took nearly an hour. The road climbed away from the town and then leveled out across open grassland, and the stars came out one at a time, and then all at once in a way that Rowena, who had spent her whole life in places where the sky was interrupted by rooftops and chimneys, found startling. The darkness was a different kind of darkness out here. It was not empty. It was full of something she did not yet have the right word for. Something patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to human worry. Cormac drove the team with easy competence. No wasted motion, no unnecessary adjustments. He had done this so many times that the horses and the man had arrived at some mutual understanding that required no discussion. Rowena sat beside him on the bench, and the boy sat on her other side, and not once during the full hour of that drive did any of the three of them say more than a handful of words. But the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who were waiting to understand each other before they tried to speak, and Rowena had always trusted that kind of silence more than easy conversation. Once when the wagon hit a deep rut, and Rowena gripped the side of the bench to steady herself, she felt the boy shift slightly beside her, not pulling away, not moving closer, simply adjusting, the way a creature does when it is calibrating how much space to allow. She did not look at him. She looked straight ahead at the darkness and the road and the pale strip of sky above the distant ridgeline, and she waited. Ashfield appeared in the darkness as a collection of lights, yellow rectangles of window glow and the bulk of a barn and a house built of heavy timber that looked like it had been made to last a very long time. Cormac pulled the team to a stop and set the brake and climbed down, and then he paused beside the wagon and looked up at Rowena with an expression she could not fully read in the darkness. It was not awkward, exactly. It was something more like careful. A man making sure he was doing the right thing before he did it. He offered his hand to help her down. She took it. His palm was rough and warm, and he released her the moment she was steady on her feet, with a distance that was respectful and nothing more. The house was larger inside than she had anticipated. A main room with a fireplace already burning low, a long table of dark wood, shelves along one wall carrying a mix of practical items and a few things that were not practical at all. A small carved bird sitting on its side, a book with its cover worn completely away, a single blue cup sitting apart from all the others as though it had been placed there specifically and not moved since. The kind of object that meant something to the person who had put it there, and that no one else in the house would move without a permission that had never been asked. Against the far wall, a narrow staircase led up to the second floor, and at the end of the main hallway, past the kitchen, past the room that was clearly being used as some kind of small study, there was a door. They painted the same color as the walls around it, but somehow more present, more deliberate. Closed with the particular firmness of a door that was not simply shut, but decided upon. Cormac did not mention it. He showed her the kitchen, which was well stocked and organized by someone who knew how a kitchen worked. He showed her the room that was to be hers. Small, facing east, with a window that would catch the morning light. On the table beside the narrow bed, someone had placed a brimming pitcher of water and a candle in a plain holder, and beside those, still in its small paper box, an iron door latch, the kind that could be bolted from the inside. He had not installed it yet, but he had left it there, and the intention in that small, deliberate gesture said more about the man than anything he had managed to put into writing. "If you need anything in the night," he said, and then stopped, as though he had started the sentence before he knew how to finish it. He settled for, "The kitchen fire bank's slow. There'll be warmth in the morning." She thanked him. He nodded once and went out, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then, above her head, the creak of floorboards settling into silence. She did not sleep for a long time. She sat on the edge of the bed with her wooden box on the table beside her and listened to the sounds of the house, the way old timber breathes and sighs and adjusts itself through the night, the wind moving across the grassland outside, and somewhere on the floor above her, the thin, high sound of a boy coughing. It came in intervals, not constant. It would be quiet for a long stretch, and then return, dry and hollow, the kind of sound that took effort to produce and left nothing better behind it. Rowena sat very still and listened to the pattern of it. Too slow for an infection working at full pitch. Too persistent for something passing through. The sound of a body fighting something it had been fighting for a while. Something it had partly adapted to. Something that had become ordinary enough that the people who heard it every night had stopped truly hearing it. She had heard that kind of ordinary before. She knew what it meant. She set her hands flat on her knees and looked at the dark wall across from her and thought about the boy's arm. Because it was then, sitting in that quiet, that she let herself think about what she had seen. She had not planned to see it. After Cormac had shown her the house and gone upstairs, Rowena had stood alone in the main room for a moment, taking stock of the space with the unhurried attention she gave everything. The boy had come downstairs without a sound. She had not heard him until he was already in the doorway, and she had looked up to find him watching her with those same steady, measuring eyes. He had looked at her face, and then, in the way of children who have not yet learned to be subtle, he had looked at the wooden box she still carried. He crossed the room without speaking. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see clearly, not close enough to be approachable, and he looked at the box with the focused attention of someone who already knew what was in it, or at least knew the category of thing it was. And then, with the kind of simple, declarative movement that only children manage, he pushed his sleeve up to the elbow and held out his arm. The light in the main room was warm and steady, and it showed her everything clearly. The vein on the inside of his wrist, blue-green beneath pale skin, and scattered across the soft skin of his inner arm, beginning just below the crook of his elbow and trailing toward his wrist. A series of small bruises, faint, faded at the edges to yellow-green in the way of bruises that were not new, not clustered in the pattern of impact, not aligned the way bruises from ordinary childhood falls would fall, scattered, small, and very specifically located in the places where the skin was thinnest. She had seen that pattern before, not on a child, on a woman she had cared for many years ago, in different circumstances entirely, on a woman who had been given something her body could not properly process and had bruised beneath the surface while everything appeared, on the outside, ordinary. Rowena had looked at Jasper's arm and then at his face, and he had looked back at her, not afraid, not asking for anything she could name, just showing her, trusting her, in the wordless and complete way of children, to understand what he could not articulate. He had pulled his sleeve down. He had walked out of the room and up the stairs without a sound, and Rowena had stood in the firelight with the wooden box against her chest and felt something very precise and very cold settle at the center of her thinking. Not panic, because she was not the kind of person who panicked, but clarity. The kind that arrived without invitation and stayed. She was still sitting with it when the sound of a door opening above her broke the quiet. Footsteps moved across the ceiling, deliberate, slow, and stopped. She heard the soft sound of a grown man listening in the dark, the specific stillness of someone who had learned to track the sound of coughing the way a person tracks weather. She recognized it not because she had heard it from Cormac Bell before. She had known him less than 3 hours. But because she had heard it from every parent who had ever sat beside her in a sick room, holding their breath and waiting to understand what was happening to someone they loved. She stood and opened her bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. He was at the bottom of the stairs. She did not know when he had come down. She had not heard him on the steps. He stood with one shoulder against the wall and his arms loose at his sides and his eyes closed, and he was listening with his whole body to the sound of his son coughing above them. His face in the dim light from the banked kitchen fire was not the face he had shown her on the drive from town. The careful, composed face of a man managing an introduction. This was something much older and quieter and more worn. A face that had been doing this, standing in the dark and listening and not knowing what to do with what it heard, for a long time. He opened his eyes and saw her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the dark and the silence had not already said more clearly. She could see in his face the question he was not asking. The question she understood. The question she had no answer for yet. She could see the weight of 4 years of nights like this one, the accumulated grief of a man who had never been given a better explanation and had learned to endure the one he had. The coughing stopped. The house went quiet again. Cormac looked at her for a moment longer, something shifting almost imperceptibly in his expression, something that was not quite hope and not quite surrender but lived in the space between them. Then he turned and went back up the stairs without a word, and Rowena stood in the hallway and listened to his footsteps fade and thought about everything she had seen and heard and felt since the moment she stepped off that coach. She went back to her room. She sat with her wooden box open on the table before her and let her mind move through it the way it always moved, quietly, methodically, without rushing toward conclusions it had not yet earned. The boy was unwell. The cough was wrong. The bruising was wrong. And the man upstairs, who was clearly not a careless father, who had stocked the kitchen with care and left a latch on her table and kept his house with the quiet discipline of a person who was holding something together through sheer will, that man had somehow been persuaded not to look too closely at the thing that was wrong with his son. Rowena did not yet know how. She did not yet know why. She knew only what she always knew, which was that there was a difference between a thing that was true and a thing that people had agreed to call true. And she had spent enough years learning that difference. At some cost, it had to be said, at considerable personal cost, that she no longer had much patience for the second kind. She closed the box and latched it and set it on the table by the window where the morning light would find it first. Then she lay down on top of the blanket with her coat still on and listened to the silence of Ashfield Ranch, and she thought, something is wrong here. Something that everyone around it has been looking at for long enough that they have stopped seeing it. She was still thinking it when she finally, sometime before dawn, fell asleep. She did not know yet that in a few hours a man would arrive at the front door with a warm smile and a careful word for everyone and a particular kind of attention directed at her. The kind of attention that dressed itself as welcome, but was really something else entirely. She did not know yet that his name was Reverend Obadiah Finch, and that in Greystone Hollow his word carried more weight than almost anything else. She only knew what the morning would show her, which was a boy sitting at the kitchen table, eating very little, watching her with eyes that were much older than 9, waiting to see what kind of woman she turned out to be. She intended to show him. The first week at Ashfield passed the way first weeks often do, in the accumulation of small things, the kind that do not announce themselves as important until later, when you look back and realize they were the whole story all along. Rowena learned the rhythms of the house before she learned anything else. She had always worked that way, attending to pattern before attempting change, the way a careful reader finishes a page before turning it. Cormac rose before light and was outside before the kitchen fire had properly caught. He came in for coffee at a fixed hour, drank it standing at the counter in 3 or 4 long swallows, and went back out. He returned at midday, ate whatever was on the table without comment, and returned to work. In the evenings he came in later, washed at the pump outside the back door, and sat at the table with a quietness that was not unfriendly, but was entirely self-contained. A man who had long since learned to fill his own silence, and did not require anyone to fill it for him. Jasper ate breakfast before his father came in. He sat at the far end of the table with a book or without one, and he ate slowly and not very much. And he watched Rowena from beneath the dark fringe of his hair with an attention she had come to recognize as his primary mode of engaging with the world. He did not speak to her in those first days, but he did not leave the room when she entered it, which she understood, from long experience with people who were deciding whether to trust, was its own kind of statement. On the third morning, she adjusted breakfast. Nothing dramatic. She added warm broth alongside the bread, thickened it with a little rendered fat and dried herbs from the tin she had found in the back of the pantry. She put a smaller portion of bread on Jasper's plate and a larger portion of the broth, and she set it down in front of him without comment or explanation. He looked at it. He looked at her. He ate it, slowly at first, then with more intention, as though his body recognized something his mind had not caught up to yet. She kept her expression entirely neutral. She went back to the stove and did not watch him finish. That evening, Cormac came in to find his own plate rearranged in a similar fashion. Broth forward, lighter on the bread, a few slices of dried apple on the side that she had rehydrated with a small amount of warm water, and a pinch of something that smelled faintly of clove. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. He sat down and ate everything on it without a word. And when he was done, he said, very quietly, that it was good. Then he took his coffee and went to sit by the fire, and that was the entirety of the conversation. And Rowena found she did not need it to be more than that. What she needed was to keep watching Jasper. She did it carefully, with the same patience she had developed over years of sitting beside people whose bodies were telling stories that no one around them was reading properly. She watched the way he carried himself through the day, the slight drag in his step by mid-afternoon, the way he pressed his palm flat against his thigh when he thought no one was looking, as though steadying something from the inside. She watched the mornings, which were better, and the evenings, which were not. She watched what he ate and what he left, how long he slept, and the particular quality of the silence he kept when he was managing discomfort he did not know how to name. She needed to see the medicine. She had thought about how to accomplish this and had set it aside and come back to it and set it aside again, because the direct approach was closed to her. She had already learned that much. On her fourth day at Ashfield, she had asked Cormac, in the most neutral and practical voice she possessed, whether she might take a look at whatever remedies the household kept, so she could understand what was already being done for Jasper's cough and not duplicate anything by accident. Cormac had looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Not suspicion exactly, but something more like the face of a person repeating something they had been told. Dr. Price had asked that the regimen not be adjusted or supplemented without his knowing. He visited regularly. It was better to leave things as they were. She had nodded. She had said, of course. And she had gone back to the kitchen and stood at the window looking out at the open grassland and turned those words over in her mind like stones she was looking under. Dr. Price had asked, not recommended, asked, as though the information about what was in that medicine was something to be managed, not shared. She filed it. She waited. On the fifth day, she went into Greystone Hollow. Cormac drove her in the wagon and left her at the general store with a short list of supplies and said he had business at the farrier's and would be back inside the hour. The general store was run by a woman named Marin Cole, a widow somewhere in her mid-40s, with red-chapped hands and a directness in her eyes that Rowena recognized immediately as someone who had learned to do without the things other people relied on for comfort. She did not offer false warmth. She offered accurate information about stock levels and fair prices, and when Rowena asked whether they carried dried valerian, Marin had simply gone to the back shelf and found it without asking what it was for. Rowena liked her immediately. They talked in the way of women who are both essentially practical about the store and the town and the season coming in. Marin mentioned that winter came early this far west and that Rowena would want heavier wool than she had likely brought with her. She mentioned that the church held a community gathering on the first Sunday of each month, and that most people attended, and that Reverend Finch was a good speaker. She said this plainly, neither warmly nor coldly, the way a person states a fact they have no particular feeling about. She mentioned that Dr. Price had been in that town for going on 3 years now, since Finch had brought him, and that people had come to rely on him. Rowena kept her voice easy and her manner idle. Dr. Price visits the Bell Ranch regularly, I understand. Marin's hand stilled briefly on the counter, just briefly, just a half-second of pause that Rowena would not have caught if she had not been watching for exactly that kind of thing. Then Marin went on tallying the supplies. He has done since the bellboy started ailing. The family is fortunate to have that kind of attention. A sound that carried weight without committing to any particular shape. Then, after a moment, Finch arranged it. The Reverend looks after his own, you could say. Cormac Bell had a hard time of it after his wife passed. Finch stepped in. Rowena looked at a display of ribbon she had no interest in, and thought about the word arranged and the word stepped, and the particular quality of care that made itself indispensable before you noticed it was doing so. She paid for her supplies. On her way out, she paused as though just remembering something and turned back to ask, lightly, conversationally, the way you ask about something that does not really matter. Whether the prescription supplies came through the store or were brought in separately. Marin looked at her for a moment. Brought in. Finch handles the ordering. Rowena smiled and thanked her, and went out into the autumn light and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her basket and her valerian and her thoughts, and she looked down the street at the white church at the far end with its single bell tower, and she thought about a reverend who arranged doctors and managed medicine orders and stepped in when a man was grieving and too exhausted to look carefully at anything. She thought about how such a person would seem to everyone around him like the very best kind of neighbor, how his authority would settle over a community like weather, gradually, completely, until it simply was the climate and no one remembered choosing it. She thought about Jasper's arm. She was still thinking about it when Reverend Finch himself appeared at her left elbow, as though she had somehow summoned him by the direction of her attention. He was not what she had constructed in her mind during those 5 days of careful, quiet thinking. She had imagined someone with the obvious features of authority, stern, self-important, the kind of man who announced his consequence through the set of his jaw or the volume of his voice. Finch was none of those things. He was a man of perhaps 60, with a wide, good-humored face and gray at his temples, and the kind of unhurried ease in his bearing that comes either from genuine contentment or from years of practice at performing it. He shook her hand with both of his and said he was delighted she had come to Greystone Hollow, and he said it as though he meant it. He asked about the journey. He asked whether Ashfield suited her. He asked these questions with real attention, the kind that made a person feel seen, and Rowena smiled and answered and kept her own attention everywhere at once. When she mentioned Jasper, gently, briefly, expressing only that the boy seemed a bit worn and that she hoped the coming season would be kinder to him, Finch's expression shifted into something so perfectly calibrated to sympathetic concern that she would have believed it entirely if she had not already been looking for the mechanism beneath it. "Dr. Price is doing everything that can be done," Finch said. His voice was gentle, certain, the voice of a man who had delivered this particular reassurance so many times it had become as natural as breathing. "The boy carries grief, as children do. The soul heals at its own pace. You mustn't worry yourself too much on his behalf, Miss Voss. That kind of anxiety, well-intentioned as it is, can sometimes create a disturbance where rest is what's needed." It was masterfully done. In the space of 4 sentences, he had reduced her concern to anxiety, reframed Jasper's illness as spiritual rather than physical, praised her intentions in a way that simultaneously dismissed her capacity for judgment, and positioned rest, meaning by implication, non-interference, as the appropriate response. All of it delivered with the warmth of a man who genuinely believed he was helping. Rowena looked at him and said that she was sure he was right, and that she looked forward to seeing him at the Sunday gathering, and she walked to the wagon and waited for Cormac with her hands quiet in her lap and her mind moving fast behind her eyes. The gathering that Sunday was held in the church hall, a long room behind the main sanctuary, heated with 2 iron stoves and filled with folding chairs and long tables, and the accumulated smell of wood smoke and pine cleaner and food brought in from a dozen different kitchens. Most of the town was there. Rowena sat beside Cormac and watched people greet him. The particular way they greeted him, with a warmth that had something cautious underneath it. The warmth of people who cared for someone they had also, quietly, given up on. They greeted her with curiosity carefully dressed as friendliness. They asked where she was from and what she thought of the West and whether she was settling in well, and she answered all of it pleasantly and watched their faces while they watched hers. Jasper sat on Cormac's other side and ate almost nothing and did not speak to anyone. One woman, round-faced, kind-eyed, who introduced herself as Della Pruitt, bent down to his level and spoke to him directly, asking him something about his studies. He looked at her for a moment before answering, as though calibrating the cost of the effort. When he did speak, his voice was clear and his answer was precise, and the intelligence behind his eyes was entirely evident. He was not a child made slow by sorrow. He was a child made slow by something physical, something that was leaching the brightness out of him in increments too gradual for anyone who saw him every day to measure. But she could measure it. She had only been here a week, and she could already see the outline of what was being taken from him. She was thinking about this, sitting at the long table with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, when Finch rose to speak. He moved to the front of the room with the unhurried authority of a man entirely at home in his own consequence, and he spoke well. She had to grant him that. He spoke about the community and its responsibilities toward one another, about the particular grace of neighbors who did not wait to be asked before offering what they had. He looked at Rowena once during the address, and the look was warm and welcoming and entirely deliberate. He was establishing her place in the room. He was deciding what that place would be and offering it to her as a gift and expecting her to receive it as one. She received it with a smile and kept her own counsel. After the gathering ended and the tables were being cleared, a woman Rowena did not yet know came and stood beside her, small-framed, with the unhurried manner of someone who had nothing to prove and had arrived at that condition the hard way. She introduced herself as the wife of one of the ranchers to the south of Ashfield, and she spoke to Rowena the way people speak when they have been waiting for someone to speak to, not with urgency, but with relief, as though a valve had been found and opened. Her youngest child had had a persistent cough for 2 winters running. She asked, in a voice kept carefully beneath the ambient noise of the room, whether Rowena had any thoughts on coughs that were not truly chest coughs, but seemed to settle below the throat and above the lungs, somewhere in between, and resisted the usual remedies. Rowena asked 4 questions and listened to the answers, and thought about what she had heard, and she said, in the same quiet register, that there was a preparation of thyme and honey, and something she could compound herself that often helped with exactly that pattern, and that she would be glad to send some out. The woman looked at her with an expression that was not gratitude exactly. It was something more like recognition, the look of a person who has been brought something they needed without knowing quite what name to put to the need. Finch was watching from across the room. Rowena saw him without appearing to see him, which was a skill she had developed over many years of working in spaces where what you knew and what you showed were 2 entirely different things. His expression, as he watched that brief exchange, was not hostile. It was the expression of a man recalibrating, noting a development he had not anticipated, filing it carefully, deciding what it meant for the order of things he had established over a long time with considerable effort. She filed that away too. The week between the Sunday gathering and the rainy afternoon was its own kind of instruction. Rowena learned things about Ashfield that did not come from observation but from the slower accumulation of living in a place. The way the late afternoon light through the kitchen window fell differently on certain days when the cloud cover thinned and the air had a particular quality of stillness that preceded weather. The way Cormac's movements through the house in the evenings had begun to carry a subtle change in rhythm. Less the pattern of a man maintaining a holding position, and more the pattern of a man who had stopped treating his own house as a problem to be managed. She noticed these things and did not speak of them, and kept them in the same careful interior filing system she kept everything else, unmarked and without conclusion, waiting for the moment when they would tell her what they meant. She also noticed that Jasper had started eating more at breakfast, not dramatically, not the appetite of a child restored to health all at once, but incrementally, the way things return when they have been slowly taken. A second spoonful of broth, the whole of the bread on the plate rather than half. Small signals in a language she had been learning to read for years, in people of all ages, and that now, in this small particular morning ritual at the long kitchen table, told her something she was not yet ready to say aloud, but was beginning, quietly and without fanfare, to believe. The rainy afternoon came 6 days later. Rowena was at the kitchen table, going through the notes she kept in a small leather-covered journal. Observations, in the careful shorthand she had developed over years of work, that someone else would have needed a key to decipher. She closed the journal when she heard footsteps in the doorway, without hurry, and looked up. Jasper stood there. He had been outside, she could see from the damp at his collar, and he had come in not because he was cold, but because he had decided to. He looked at the table, and then at the journal she had closed, and then at her. And he crossed the room and sat down across from her with the deliberate self-possession of someone twice his age. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Rowena reached for a blank sheet of paper from the stack she kept for household notes and drew, simply, without preamble, without asking whether he was interested, a rough diagram of the human heart. Just the shape of it, the 4 chambers, the way the blood moved through it. She labeled nothing. She simply drew it and set the pencil down. Jasper looked at it. He picked up the pencil. He added a line she had left out, connecting 2 chambers in the way she had simplified away from. She looked at the addition. She raised her eyebrows fractionally in genuine surprise and looked at him. He was watching her face to see what she would do with the correction. She took the pencil and added the next vessel and handed it back. They worked through it that way for nearly an hour, building the diagram by turn, each addition a question, each response an answer, both of them in a conversation that required no words at all. At some point, Jasper began to ask actual questions, spoken aloud with the kind of careful phrasing that suggested he had been holding them for a long time, waiting for someone who would answer them rather than simply reassure him. He asked about blood and about breathing and about why a person's hands go numb and whether that was the same as when a person felt cold all the way through, even when the room was warm. She answered each question exactly as it deserved to be answered, honestly, precisely, with the appropriate complexity. She did not simplify in the way of adults who believe children are not ready for the truth. She had never believed that. In her experience, children who asked careful questions were doing so because they had already worked out, on their own, that something was wrong and simply needed someone to confirm that their reasoning was sound. Jasper was that kind of child. Cormac appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during that hour and stopped. Rowena did not look up, but she registered the change in the room, the slight shift in Jasper's posture that indicated he had noticed his father arrive, the quality of the silence that followed. Cormac did not speak. He stood in the doorway for a long moment and then withdrew without a sound, and Rowena heard his footsteps move away down the hall with a quietness that was not retreat but decision, a man choosing not to interrupt something that was working. That evening, after Jasper had gone upstairs and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she came out of her room to find that someone had set a fresh cup of coffee on the kitchen table alongside the journal she had left there earlier. The coffee was exactly the right temperature, not freshly poured, but not cold. Timed. She stood in the kitchen in the dim light and looked at the cup for a moment. Then she sat down, opened the journal, and drank it slowly. Cormac came in from outside 20 minutes later, stomping mud from his boots at the back door. He did not seem surprised to find her there. He poured himself a cup and stood at the counter, and they occupied the same room in the same silence they had been building for over a week, but it was a different silence now. Something had shifted in it. Some partition had thinned slightly, without either of them having made any deliberate move toward it. He said, "He talked today." She said, "He did." There was a pause in which neither of them said what they were actually thinking, which was something that would have required more certainty than either of them had yet. Then Cormac said quietly, and without accusation, "Price says the less the boy focuses on his physical symptoms, the better." Rowena wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table. She kept her voice even and her words simple and entirely without edge. Children who are given accurate information about their own bodies tend to feel less afraid, not more. Cormac was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup in his hands the way he did when he was thinking something through without wanting to be seen doing it. Then he said, "He looked better this afternoon." "Yes," Rowena said. "He did." That was all. But Cormac did not disagree with what had happened that afternoon, which was what mattered. He was looking now. That was what mattered. 2 days later, Rowena found herself in the back section of Marin's store on a practical errand, cloth for curtains that the kitchen window genuinely needed, when she saw the order ledger open on the counter beside the till. Marin was in the back room, moving crates, and the store was quiet. Rowena did not reach for the ledger. She stood where she was, at a respectful distance, and she looked at the page it was open to the way she looked at everything. Quietly, fully, taking in what was there without arranging it into a shape it had not already chosen for itself. The regular prescription supply order, listed items, quantities, intervals of delivery, destination, Bell Ranch, payment notation, in a different hand from the order itself, at the bottom of the entry, settled through the office of Reverend O. Finch. She had known it. Marin had told her as much. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and seeing it written in the ordinary ledger of an ordinary store, the matter-of-fact record of a transaction that had been occurring at regular intervals for a very long time. Long enough that it had become invisible. Long enough that no one thought to ask why a reverend was managing the prescription costs for a ranch owner who, as far as Rowena could determine, had no reason to need that kind of financial help. She thought about the word arranged. She thought about the word stepped. She moved away from the counter and looked at the fabric bolts on the back wall, and her face was entirely composed by the time Marin came back in from the storeroom, and she bought the cloth she had come for and talked about the weather and the approaching cold. And she walked out into the afternoon with everything she had learned held tightly and carefully inside her, like a lamp carried in wind. That night, the cough returned, not the brief, settled sound it had been over the past several days. Something rougher, less rhythmic, a body working harder than it should have needed to. Rowena lay in the dark and listened to it and thought about the boy's arm and the ledger entry and the particular shape of Finch's reassurance on the boardwalk. She lay still and let it all settle into the shape it was making. And she made, in the quiet privacy of her own mind, a decision that was not dramatic and did not announce itself as important, but was both of those things. She was going to find out what was in that medicine, and she was going to find out why a reverend who delivered sermons on trust was the one controlling access to it. The cough subsided. The house went still. Somewhere above her, she heard Cormac's footsteps cross the floor and stop. In the same place they always stopped, she now knew. The place in the hall where the sound of Jasper's breathing carried best, standing in the dark, listening, carrying the same weight he had carried every night for years. She did not go to him. She had been present in that hallway once already, on her first night, and she had understood then what she understood now. Some griefs were still his alone, and the right thing was not always to enter the room, but sometimes to stand outside it and trust the person inside to find their own way toward morning. What she could offer him was not presence in the dark, but something better and more lasting. A reason, eventually, to stop standing there. She turned onto her side and looked at the faint line of moonlight under the door and waited for morning with the patience of someone who had learned that the right moment was always worth waiting for, and that arriving early to a confrontation was almost always the same as losing it. The morning would come, and when it did, she would be ready. The fever came without announcement, settling into Jasper's body sometime in the deep of a restless night, quiet and uninvited and already present by the time anyone thought to name it. Not a high fever, not the kind that announced itself with drama and urgency and sent people running for cold water and prayer. It was the low, persistent kind, the kind that settles into a child's body like a house guest who has decided to stay indefinitely, making everything slightly worse without making anything dramatically terrible. Jasper's cheeks carried a faint flush that was almost pretty in the firelight, and his eyes were glassy in the way that looked, to someone not paying attention, simply like tiredness. Rowena had been paying attention. She had spent the previous 4 days quietly reducing the evening dose, not eliminating it, not making any change dramatic enough to be noticed, simply adjusting by increments too small to remark upon. She had replaced a portion of what was in the small bottle with a tincture of her own preparation, something gentle and entirely harmless, something that would ease the body's adjustment without forcing it. She had done this with the careful, unhurried precision of someone who understood that the goal was not to win an argument, but to help a child, and that those two things sometimes required entirely different approaches. The fever was the body's answer, not a worsening, a recalibration. She recognized it the way she recognized most things about Jasper's condition now, not with certainty, because certainty in medicine was always a kind of arrogance, but with the particular confidence that comes from having seen a pattern often enough to trust what it was telling you. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the early hours of the morning, a lamp turned low, when she heard Cormac's step on the stair, faster than usual, less measured. He came into the kitchen already dressed and stopped when he saw her. "He's warm," he said. The words came out stripped of the careful distance he usually maintained, just the fact of it, plain and worried. "I know," she said. "I've been up. It's not climbing." He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, at the lamp, at the small notebook open on the table where she had been writing, at the cup of cold tea she had forgotten to drink. Something in his expression shifted, the way a door shifts when the latch gives. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and that itself was different from anything that had come before. He had never, in all the nights of that difficult first fortnight, sat down across from her when the house was dark and the reasons for keeping distance were thin. "Tell me what you're seeing," he said. She looked at him. The lamp between them cast his face in warm, uneven light, the lines around his eyes deeper than they looked in daylight, the set of his jaw carrying a tiredness that was not tonight's tiredness, but the accumulated weight of a long time. He was not asking her to reassure him. He was asking her to be honest with him, and she understood the difference, and she honored it. She told him, not everything, not yet, because there were things she still needed to verify, and she would not hand him conclusions she could not stand behind fully. But she told him what she had observed about Jasper over the past 2 weeks, the pattern of the fatigue, the way it was worse in the hours after his evening medicine, and better in the days since she had quietly adjusted it. The bruising on his arm that she had noticed on her first night. The quality of the cough, which was not a sick chest cough, but something that came from a body under a different kind of strain. She laid it out carefully, in plain language, without reaching further than her evidence allowed her to reach. Cormac listened without interrupting. His hands were flat on the table. He did not look away from her face. When she finished, the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the ones they had been building. denser, more considered, carrying the weight of something that could not be put back once it had been looked at. Price said the cough was grief, Cormac said. His voice was entirely even. Finch said the same, that the body carries loss the way the spirit does. I know what they said, and you think they're wrong. I think they may be looking at the right child and seeing a different problem. Another silence. He turned his cup in his hands. That gesture she had come to recognize, the thing he did when he was working through something that resisted quick resolution. Then he said, without looking up, "She was tired for months, my wife. Before the end, I kept saying she needed rest. Price kept saying the same." A pause. "I should have looked harder." The sentence landed in the room with the weight of something that had been carried a long time before being set down. Rowena did not rush to fill the space around it. She let it be what it was. A man handing her a piece of his guilt, not asking her to take it from him, just needing someone to see that he was holding it. "You trusted the people around you," she said quietly. "That is not the same as failing to look." "It felt the same." "I know." She paused, then, "But you are looking now." He raised his eyes to her face, and there was something in that moment, a quality of attention between two people in a lamplit room at the wrong hour of the night, that she felt in her chest before she had words for it. Not romantic, or not only that, something more fundamental. The specific ache of being seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to look at you at all, and who had chosen to anyway. She was the one who looked away first. She looked at her notebook. "Tell me about Jasper's mother," she said. "Not the illness. Before." It was the right question, or perhaps the necessary one. Cormac was quiet for a moment, and then he began to talk in the unhurried way of someone who has held a thing so long that setting it down requires care. He talked about a woman named Clara who had come west with him when they were both young enough to believe that being willing was the same as being ready, who had made Ashfield into something habitable through sheer insistence and an apparently inexhaustible capacity for making things grow. He talked about her laugh, which he said was too loud for the church pew and that she never modulated it regardless of the occasion. He talked about the way she had taught Jasper to read before the boy was 4, sitting with him at the table every evening with the patient certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was building. He talked about the months she was ill, the way it crept in slowly, disguising itself as ordinary fatigue, the way she insisted it was nothing, and the way he had wanted to believe her, and the way Price had confirmed that belief with professional authority and a calm certainty that had felt like solid ground under Cormac's feet when everything else was shifting. "By the time I understood she wasn't getting better," he said, "she was already very far from better." He stopped. The fire in the kitchen stove crackled and settled. Rowena listened to him and thought about what it meant to be a person who protected others by staying calm when they were frightened. How such a person learned, over time, to mistake suppression for strength. She thought about the particular cruelty of a grief that came packaged as a question that could not be answered, whether things would have been different if he had pushed back sooner, demanded more, trusted his own observation over the professional verdict. She thought about how a man carrying that question might respond to the arrival, in his house, of someone who was now raising the same doubt about his son. He could have turned away from it. He was still here. "When I came here," she said after a moment, "I lost a position I had held for many years, because I said something that the people around me did not want to be true." He looked at her. "A man I worked alongside made an error in his treatment of a patient. Not a small error. I saw it. I reported it to the people above him. She kept her voice level, uninflected. He was well regarded. He had connections and a reputation and the confidence of everyone who mattered. And I was more easily dismissed than he was. What happened? He kept his position. I was let go. There was a formal process that arrived at a conclusion that everyone involved found more comfortable than the alternative. She looked at her hands on the table. The patient did not recover. I do not know whether things would have been different if anyone had listened to me. I choose to believe it would have mattered. I am not certain it would have. The honesty of that last sentence, the admission that she did not know, that certainty was not something she was offering, seemed to reach him more than any confidence would have. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You came all the way out here after that. There was not much left to stay for. And you brought that box." She looked up. He was looking at the wooden box, which she had set on the kitchen shelf that morning, as she had taken to doing, keeping it visible, keeping it near. "Yes," she said, "because you were going to keep doing the work, because it is the only work I know how to do well." The silence that followed was the warmest one they had found yet. Outside, the wind moved across the grassland and made the lamp flame shiver without going out. Somewhere above them, Jasper slept through his fever with the steadiness of a body that was managing, that was working, that had been given room to work. Rowena was the one who finally said, in a voice that was careful and not quite casual, "I need to understand what he has been given, Cormac. Not to interfere, to understand. There is a difference between those two things." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, crossed to the hallway, and came back with a small cloth bag from the shelf beside the staircase, the shelf she had noticed and not touched, because touching it without permission would have cost her the trust she had been building for weeks. He set it on the table in front of her. "Price brings it monthly," he said. "I've never looked closely at what's in it." She opened the bag, lifted out the 2 small bottles inside, read the labels in her own careful way. The components listed in the shorthand of someone confident their work would not be questioned, confident that the person receiving the medicine would not know enough to question it. She held the first bottle up to the lamp. The liquid inside was pale amber, clear, unremarkable. She knew what was in it, or close enough to knowing that the difference was technical rather than meaningful. She set the bottle down. She looked at Cormac. She did not yet say what she knew, because what she knew was not yet enough. She had an understanding of what was likely, not a certainty, and she had promised herself she would not hand him conclusions before she could stand behind them entirely. What she said was, "I would like to have this examined by someone with the equipment to do it properly. It would take time. It would require sending something out and waiting for a response." She paused. "And it would need to be done without Price or Finch knowing." Cormac looked at her for a long moment across the lamp. His face was doing the thing it did, the internal working through, the resistance and the reckoning. Then he said, "Is he in danger? Right now?" "Less than he was a week ago," she said. And then, because he deserved the rest of it, "I believe the adjustment I have made to his evening routine has helped. I should have told you I was doing that." He absorbed this. He did not look angry. He looked like a man arriving at a question he had been circling for a long time. "Did you think I wouldn't let you?" I thought you had been told not to let anyone adjust anything. And I thought Jasper needed the adjustment before I had enough to show you why. The silence stretched. Then, show me what you have. She showed him the small notebook with its careful shorthand unpacked into plain language for his benefit. The observations about the bruising, the fatigue pattern, the change in Jasper's appearance and energy since the dose had been quietly altered. She showed him the weight of it, not as an argument, but as a record. Evidence gathered by someone who had been watching his son with more sustained attention than anyone else in that house had managed in a very long time. He sat with it. She let him. Then the door at the top of the stairs opened, and there were small, careful feet on the steps, and Jasper appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightclothes, hair disordered from sleep, cheeks still faintly flushed. He looked at his father. He looked at Rowena. He looked at the lamp between them and the open notebook and the cloth bag from the shelf, and he took in all of it with those steady, too old eyes. He said, "I feel better than yesterday." His voice was quiet and entirely matter of fact. He crossed to the table and sat down in the chair beside Rowena as though that were the natural place for him to be, and he looked at the notebook with frank curiosity, and after a moment Rowena turned it so he could see what was written there. "That's about me," he said. "Yes," she said. He studied it for a moment. Then he looked at his father. Something passed between them. Not words, just the particular look of two people who have been managing a shared fear in separate silences and have just, without deciding to, arrived at the same room. Cormac reached across the table. He put his hand over his son's and left it there. Rowena looked at the lamp. She did not look at either of them, because some moments did not belong to observers, and she had learned over a long time of sitting beside people in their hardest hours that the most respectful thing she could offer was the dignity of not witnessing what was not hers to witness. She heard Jasper say quietly, "The medicine makes me feel heavy." And Cormac's answer, lower still, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." A pause. A child's pragmatic grace. Rowena probably knew. She kept her eyes on the lamp and said nothing, but she felt the warmth of the room settle around her like something earned, like something that had been waiting at the end of a long road that she was only now understanding she had been walking. 3 days later, the package went out with the mail rider, a sealed vial and a letter of inquiry directed to a physician she had once worked alongside, a man of scrupulous integrity and no connection to Greystone Hollow. The letter asked specific questions about specific compounds and requested a written response. She had told Cormac exactly what she had sent and why. He had nodded. He had not told Price. He had not told Finch. The morning after the package was sent, Finch arrived at Ashfield unannounced for the first time since Rowena had come. He came with warmth and without warning, and he sat in the main room and talked about the community and the coming winter and the gathering on Sunday, and he said, with perfect gentleness, that he had heard Jasper's evening routine had been adjusted, and that Dr. Price was naturally concerned about any changes made outside his supervision, and that, and here the warmth in his voice carried its first trace of something cooler beneath it, a woman without formal standing in the profession, however well-intentioned, could expose herself and the household to considerable difficulty if an outcome were to be other than hoped for. He did not look at Rowena when he said it. He looked at Cormac, because Cormac was the one whose agreement mattered, and Finch understood that completely. Cormac looked back at him with a face entirely without the flinch that Finch was expecting. The flinch of a man who had spent 4 years accepting the certainty of the people around him. There was no flinch. There was only a long, steady look. And then Cormac said, "Thank you for coming, Reverend. We'll be in touch if we need anything." Finch left. The sound of his wagon faded down the road. Rowena stood at the kitchen window and watched the dust settle. Behind her, from the table, Jasper said, "He's not going to like that." Cormac came to stand beside her at the window. He looked out at the empty road. His shoulder was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him. "No," he said, "he's not." And then, without turning, in the same quiet voice he used for the things that mattered most, "I should have looked harder, sooner. I know that. But I'm looking now." A pause. "We're looking now." The word landed the way it was meant to. Rowena felt it in the place behind her sternum where things settled when they were true. Outside, the wind moved across the open grassland, bending the dry grass in long silver waves toward the horizon. The lamp in the window held its light against the afternoon, small and steady, and not going anywhere. The response from the physician came back faster than Rowena had expected. She was in the kitchen when the mail rider came up the road, and she watched from the window as Cormac walked out to meet him, exchanged a few words, and came back to the house with a sealed envelope in his hand. He set it on the table in front of her without opening it. He stood back, the way he had learned to stand in relation to her work, present but not crowding it, giving her the space the task required. She opened it. She read it twice, the first time quickly, and the second time with the deliberate attention of someone making sure they were reading what was actually there, and not what they had expected to find. Then she set it flat on the table and put both hands beside it and looked at the window. "Tell me," Cormac said. She told him. The compound in the bottle was a sedative preparation, not a dangerous one in correct use, not something a person would prescribe with malicious intent as a first assumption. It was used in appropriate circumstances for adults with acute sleeplessness, with anxiety that prevented ordinary function, with certain kinds of persistent agitation. It was not, under any standard of careful practice that the physician could identify, something that would be prescribed for a child of Jasper's age at the dosage and duration indicated by the label on the bottle. The cumulative effect of such a preparation, given in the way it had been given, over the period of time it appeared to have been given, would produce exactly the pattern she had been observing. Fatigue, reduced appetite, peripheral bruising in areas of thin skin, a persistent low-grade respiratory heaviness that mimicked the symptoms of grief-related physical decline closely enough to be mistaken for it by someone who was looking for exactly that. The physician's letter concluded with a sentence that she read aloud, because Cormac deserved to hear it in full. That the prescribing of such a compound to a child under these circumstances warranted serious review by anyone with the authority to conduct it. The kitchen was very quiet. Cormac stood at the counter with his arms at his sides and his face doing nothing visible, which was the thing his face did when he was experiencing something that went too deep for surface expression. She had come to recognize it the way she recognized the pattern of Jasper's fatigue, by its consistency, by the specific quality of the stillness it produced. He was not a man who wept easily or loudly. He was a man who went very still when the ground shifted under him, as though stillness were the only thing between him and something he could not afford to lose control of. She waited. She did not fill the silence. She had learned, over weeks of living alongside this man and his son, that the silence was where Cormac Bell did his most important work. Finally, he said, very quietly, "How long?" "Since before I arrived," she said. The pattern in what I observed was already established. Months at minimum. Possibly longer. Another silence. Then he crossed to the table and sat down. Not across from her, but beside her. And he picked up the letter and read it himself. She watched his eyes move across the lines, and she watched his jaw tighten and release and tighten again, and she thought about Clara, the name he had spoken in the lamplit kitchen weeks ago, the woman who had been tired for months, before anyone looked closely enough. She thought about the particular way guilt worked on a person who had already been carrying it for a long time, how a new weight did not arrive cleanly, but instead collapsed into the old weight and made it worse. He was trying to manage the grief, Cormac said. It was not a defense of Price. It was a man trying to understand what had happened to his family, working it through in the only way he knew, out loud and with care. Finch told me that when a child loses a parent, the body sometimes, that the spirit and the body aren't separate things, that Jasper needed to be calmed, to be given something to ease the transition. That may have been what Price believed, Rowena said. She chose her next words carefully. And it may also be that what felt like helping continued past the point where it was helping. And Finch. Finch trusted Price. Finch controlled what I was told. She did not answer that directly. It was not her place to tell him what to conclude about a man he had relied on through the hardest period of his life. But she looked at him steadily, and she did not look away. And he read in her steadiness everything she had not said. He stood up. He put the letter in his coat pocket. He said he was going to Greystone Hollow. She said she was coming with him. He looked at her. She could see him considering whether to argue, not because he doubted her, but because the road ahead of them was not a gentle one, and some part of him, the part that had been quietly building towards something over the past weeks, without naming it, did not want her in the path of what was coming. She picked up her coat from the peg by the door and put it on. And that was the end of the discussion. They left Jasper with Marin Cole, who had come out to Ashfield 2 days prior on the pretext of returning a pan she had borrowed, and had stayed for 3 hours, talking with Rowena in the kitchen with the easy candor of two women who had recognized each other as fundamentally trustworthy. Marin took Jasper without asking for explanation, gave Rowena a look that said she understood more than she had been told, and went back inside with the boy at her side. The drive into town was made in the particular silence of two people preparing themselves. The day was cold and high-clouded, the light flat and even across the grassland, the kind of light that made everything visible without making anything beautiful. Rowena sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the road ahead of them and thought about what she knew and what she did not know, and what the difference between those two things would mean in the next hour. Halfway to town, Cormac said, "Tell me what you think Price will do." She considered it honestly. "Accept it. He is not a man who will fight to be wrong. He made a decision and committed to it past the point where commitment served the patient, and he knows it. He has probably known it for some time without finding a way to look at it directly. Having it named in a room gives him permission to stop defending it." And Finch. Finch is more complicated. She paused, watching a hawk riding a thermal above the far ridge, very still and very deliberate. Finch believes everything he has done inside a framework of genuine belief in his own rightness. That is harder to dismantle than dishonesty, because at least dishonesty knows what it is. Cormac was quiet for a moment. You've dealt with people like him before. I have dealt with people who are certain they are helping when they are not. That is a very common kind of person. She looked at the road. They are usually not cruel. They are usually kind. That is what makes them so difficult to address without sounding like you are attacking kindness itself. That's what he'll say. That's what he'll make it sound like. Yes, she said. It is. A pause, which is why the letter matters more than anything either of us could say. He cannot frame a physician's written finding as the anxiety of a newcomer. Cormac drove. The horses knew the road and needed very little direction. After a while he said, without looking at her, I meant what I said the other morning about we. She did not look at him either. She looked at the road and the pale sky above it and felt the warmth of the words settle in her chest the same way it had settled the first time he used it, without ceremony, without anything to mark it as significant except the fact that it was. I know you did, she said. He nodded once. They drove on in a silence that was, by now, the most comfortable language either of them had. She knew what the letter said. She knew what she had observed. She knew that Price had prescribed something inappropriate for a child over an extended period, and that the money for that prescription had passed through Finch's hands, and that Cormac had been actively discouraged from seeking a second perspective. What she did not know, what she was careful not to assume, was the architecture of intent behind all of it. Whether Price had acted from negligence or from something darker, whether Finch had managed the situation out of a misguided certainty that he knew best, or out of something more calculated. Not knowing the difference mattered, because the difference would determine what happened next. They found Price at his small office at the end of the main street, a converted storefront with a painted sign that had been there long enough to begin fading. Cormac opened the door and went in, and Rowena followed. The office smelled of pine oil, and the particular clinical dryness of a space kept deliberately sterile, a smell that Rowena associated with every workroom she had ever known, and that in other circumstances might have felt like coming home. Price was at his desk. He was a man of perhaps 50, fair-complexioned, with the slightly rumpled look of someone who worked hard and slept inadequately, and he rose when they came in with the surprised composure of a person managing an unexpected situation by defaulting to professional courtesy. He offered chairs. He asked what he could do for them. His voice was steady and practiced and gave nothing away. Cormac put the physician's letter on the desk. Price looked at it. He did not pick it up. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been expecting to appear for a long time, without knowing when. Then he looked at Cormac, and then at Rowena, and in the way he looked at her, the brief recalibration of his expression, the slight narrowing of assessment, she understood that he had known, from the moment the package went out, that it was her doing. He was not surprised that she was here. He was only surprised it had happened this quickly. I can explain the approach to Jasper's treatment, he said. Please, Cormac said. What followed was neither a confession nor a defense, but something more complicated than either. Price explained with the careful language of a man who believed in what he was saying, while also understanding that it was not going to be received well, that he had observed in Jasper a pattern of acute anxiety and sleeplessness following his mother's death that had appeared, to his clinical eye, to pose a genuine risk to the child's long-term health. that he had prescribed a preparation intended to ease that distress and allow the body's natural recovery to proceed without interference, that the dosage had been calibrated with what he believed was appropriate care, that he had monitored the boy monthly and had not observed anything that indicated the need to adjust his approach. He said this steadily and with conviction, and Rowena believed, listening to him, that he meant most of it, that he was a man who had made a clinical decision and had committed to it with the particular stubbornness of someone who had confused consistency with correctness. The bruising, she said. She kept her voice quiet. The fatigue pattern in the afternoons. The change in respiratory quality that was consistent throughout, regardless of season. You observed these. A pause. I attributed them to the underlying condition, which was grief, which presented with significant somatic involvement, yes. A 9-year-old child, she said, still quiet. On a sedative preparation, for months. The room held the shape of what she had said. Price looked at the desk. Something moved through his face. Not shame exactly. Or not only that, more like the specific experience of a person who has been moving in one direction for so long that stopping feels like falling. Cormac said, I want it stopped. Today. I want his records, and I want your agreement that you will make no further contact with my household regarding his treatment without my explicit request. Price looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was a single motion, clean and final, the nod of a man who understood that the conversation was over, and that what came after it was no longer his to manage. They were back outside in the cold flat light within 20 minutes. Rowena stood on the boardwalk and felt the aftermath of confrontation settle through her. Not satisfaction, nothing as simple as that, but the specific quality of completion that came when a thing that had needed doing had been done. She was tired. She had not expected to feel this tired. She was still standing there when she became aware that Finch had come out of the building across the street and was walking toward them. He did not hurry. He had the unhurried ease of a man who had received news and had taken the time to compose himself before responding to it. He greeted them both with a warmth that was no less genuine for being, in this moment, also tactical. He said he had hoped to speak with them. He asked with the particular gravity of a man who had spent a lifetime asking questions designed to position the asker rather than to receive information, whether there was something he should know about. Cormac told him he did it without heat and without embellishment, in the plain, declarative language of a man who had spent too long speaking carefully and had decided to stop. Jasper was improving. Price's services were no longer required at Ashfield, and going forward, any decisions regarding his son's health would be made by himself, in consultation with Rowena, without prior arrangement by the Reverend's office. Finch listened. His expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, and then something that looked genuinely like hurt, and then the particular quality of a man understanding that a situation he believed he had managed had moved beyond his management. When Cormac finished, Finch was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Rowena. What he said was delivered with perfect gentleness and the precision of a man who knew exactly where the vulnerable place was. A woman without formal credentials placing herself between a grieving father and the medical care of his child is a serious matter. People in this community will have questions. For your sake, as much as anyone's, Cormac, I would encourage careful thought about the ground you're standing on. It was not a threat. It was something worse. A warning delivered with such evident concern that the threat within it was perfectly deniable. It was the voice of a man who had been the authority in a community for so long that he had forgotten that authority was not the same as being right. Rowena looked at him. She thought about the first Sunday gathering, about the warmth in his voice when he had explained that Jasper needed to be calmed. She thought about how long he had been managing this situation, how long he had stood at the center of it with his good intentions and his certainty and his complete, unwavering confidence in his own vision of what was best. And she thought about all the spaces his certainty had filled that would have been better left open for doubt. She said, "I understand your concern, Reverend, and I appreciate that it comes from a genuine place." She paused. But the physician's letter in Cormac's pocket was written by someone with considerably more formal standing than either of us, and it agrees with what I observed. I don't think this conversation is about credentials. Finch looked at her. For the first time in all their interactions, the warmth in his expression was entirely absent, not replaced by hostility, but simply gone, leaving something more naked underneath. A man looking at the limits of his reach. He left them. Rowena watched him go and then looked away, because watching a man understand that he had lost something was not a comfortable thing to witness, even when it was necessary. She thought the hardest part was over. She was wrong. The gathering Finch had called for 3 days later was framed in the announcement he sent around through the usual channels as a community discussion about health and welfare. The kind of broad, inclusive language that made attendance feel civic rather than compelled. But Rowena understood, when she heard about it from Marin, who had heard about it before the announcement was properly dry, what the gathering was actually for. Marin came to Ashfield that evening and sat at the kitchen table and told them plainly that Finch had spent the intervening days in conversation with every family in Greystone Hollow who had ever relied on his judgment, which was most of them, and that the conversation had taken a particular shape, not accusations, nothing as direct as that, simply questions placed with care, whether people felt comfortable with a newcomer taking such an active role in local medical matters, whether the community's arrangements for health and welfare were being respected, whether the Bell Ranch, specifically, was in good hands. Della Pruitt had stopped speaking to Rowena in the street. The merchant whose children attended the same Sunday school as Jasper had rerouted his morning walk to avoid passing the general store during the hours Rowena usually shopped. Small gestures, individually meaningless, collectively a wall being built one stone at a time. "You should know," Marin said, looking at her with the directness that had always been the thing Rowena most valued in her, "that he is telling people Jasper was progressing and that you have disrupted an established course of care. He is not saying anything untrue, technically. He is arranging what is true to say something false." Rowena sat with that for a moment. She had known this was possible. She had known it from the first conversation with Finch on the boardwalk, from the way he had framed his warning as concern. She had known it from long experience with the particular mechanism of authority protecting itself, how it did not need to lie, only to curate. "The gathering," Cormac said. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, listening. "Is he expecting me to attend?" "He is expecting you to bring her," Marin said. Rowena looked at the table. The wooden box was on the shelf above the stove, as it always was now. As natural a fixture of the Ashfield kitchen as the coffee tin and the jar of dried sage. She looked at it and she thought about the woman she had been when she packed it, standing in a room that was no longer hers, understanding that she was leaving a life that had become untenable because she had said a thing that needed to be said. She had thought, on the road west, that she was leaving that version of herself behind. That the woman who arrived at Ashfield would be the beginning of something that did not require her to stand in the center of a room and insist on something no one wanted to hear. She understood now that you did not leave that version of yourself behind. You carried it with you, and sometimes it was the most useful thing you owned. "I'll go," she said. Cormac looked at her. "Rowena." "He has told his version of this story to everyone in that town," she said. "If we don't go, our absence is its own statement, and Jasper deserves to have the true version told in the same room where the other one was offered." A silence. Then Cormac pushed off from the doorframe and stood straight. He looked at Marin. "Will you be there?" Marin's expression did not change. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to make this particular conversation worth having," she said. "I wouldn't miss it." The evening before the gathering, Jasper came to find Rowena where she was sitting on the porch steps in the cold, watching the sky go through its final colors. He sat down beside her without asking whether the space was available, in the way he had begun to do. The easy, unannounced proximity of a child who had decided that a person's company was something he wanted, and that wanting it was sufficient reason to seek it. He sat with her for a while without speaking. Then he said, "People in town are going to say things about you." "Yes," she said, "because you helped me, and they don't know how to say that was right without saying everything else was wrong." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, 9 years old, and he had understood in one clear sentence what had taken Rowena years and considerable pain to articulate. She thought about Clara, who had taught him to read before he was 4, who had sat with him at the table every evening with the patient certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was building. "That is a very precise way to put it," she said. He shrugged with the economy of motion he had gotten from his father. "Will you still be here after?" She looked back at the horizon. The last of the light was going, the sky moving through amber into something deeper. The grassland below had gone silver in the dusk. She thought about the porch and the kitchen and the wooden box on the shelf, and the sound of a child asking a question in the dark that was not really about medicine at all. She thought about a man who had said the word "we" in a tone of voice that had cost him something to use. "Yes," she said, "I'll still be here." Jasper leaned very slightly against her shoulder. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Inside the house, she could hear Cormac moving through the kitchen, the familiar sounds of evening, the particular rhythm of a household that had, in the space of a few weeks, learned a new way to breathe. She listened to it and felt something she was careful not to name yet, something that lived in the chest rather than the mind and had no interest in being catalogued. The gathering was tomorrow. What came after the gathering was not yet written. She sat on the porch steps with the boy's weight against her shoulder and watched the last of the light leave the sky. And she was, in a way she had not been in a long time, entirely ready for whatever came next. The gathering hall smelled of wood smoke and nervous people. Rowena noticed it the moment she stepped through the door. That particular quality of air in a room where many individuals had arrived carrying the same unspoken question, and were all pretending they had come for other reasons. The folding chairs had been arranged in the familiar configuration of the monthly community gathering, but the atmosphere was not that of those evenings. It was tighter, more deliberate. The kind of room where something had already been decided before anyone sat down, and the proceedings were a formality in which the deciding would be confirmed. Finch stood at the front near the iron stove, speaking with two men Rowena recognized as members of the informal council that managed the town's common concerns. He saw them come in. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. A slight realignment. A man adjusting his expectations based on new information. He had expected, Rowena suspected, either their absence or their uncertainty. He had not expected Cormac Bell to walk into that room with the particular set to his shoulders that he was wearing now, the bearing of a man who had spent a great deal of his life resolving other people's disputes and had finally arrived at one of his own. They found seats. Marin was already there in the third row, and she moved her coat from the chair beside her without being asked. Della Pruitt was across the room, and she met Rowena's eyes briefly and looked away, not with hostility, but with the expression of someone in the middle of deciding something. Finch opened the gathering in the usual way, with a few words about the community and its shared investment in one another's well-being. He was good at this. The broad frame, the language of collective concern that made any individual action seem like it belonged to everyone, and any dissent seem like a rejection of the whole. Rowena listened and watched the room and thought about what she had and what she needed. She had the physician's letter. She had Marin. She had Cormac. She had Jasper, who was not in the room. They had agreed he should stay with the family of a ranch hand who lived at the edge of Ashfield's land, but who was present in every word that was about to be said. And she was beginning to understand, something she had not fully accounted for when she first arrived in Greystone Hollow. The fact that she had been here long enough now for people to have seen her work. Della Pruitt's daughter, whose cough had cleared within a week of the guidance Rowena had offered. The ranch hand's wife, who had come to the kitchen door at Ashfield 3 weeks ago with a question about a recurring pain, and who had left with information and a small packet of dried herbs, and the expression of someone who had been given something real instead of something comfortable. Small things. Individually quiet. The kind of work that did not announce itself but left a mark anyway. When Finch reached the point in his remarks where the subject of Ashfield and its medical arrangements became explicit, he did it with the same careful language Rowena had anticipated. Concern framed as community interest, questions offered as reasonable ones deserving reasonable answers. He spoke about the established care that had been in place, about the disruption of something that had been working, about the importance of credentialed oversight in matters of children's health. He did not say Rowena's name. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew whose name belonged in the space he was leaving for it. Cormac stood up. The room shifted. People who had known Cormac Bell for years, who had watched him sit through 3 difficult years of community gatherings with the courteous, contained presence of a man managing enormous private weight, sat slightly straighter in their chairs. He did not speak immediately. He stood in the particular way he stood when something mattered, with his full weight on both feet and his hands loose at his sides, and he let the room settle around him. Then he spoke. He was not a man who used more words than a situation required, and he did not begin that habit tonight. He said that he had something to share with the room, and he said it without preamble or apology. He took the physician's letter from his coat pocket, and he read it aloud, the whole of it, in the plain, steady voice of a man reading a legal document, which, in its practical effect, was what it was. He read every line, including the final sentence about the necessity of serious review. He read it at the pace of someone who intended every word to be heard and understood, and the room was very quiet while he read it. When he finished, he folded the letter and returned it to his pocket. He looked at Finch. He said, "I am not here to assign blame to anyone in this room. I know that what was done for my son was done in the belief that it was helping him. I understand that belief. I held it myself for a long time." A pause. "But my son is better than he was a month ago. He is eating. He is sleeping without the weight that was on him. He is talking again, the way he used to talk, and asking the questions he used to ask. And he came to find me last week and told me about something funny that happened during his reading lesson." And he laughed. Another pause, shorter. "He has not laughed in 2 years. I had forgotten what it sounded like." The room held the shape of that. Maren Cole stood up from the third row. She did not have a letter. She had something more durable. 30 years of living in Greystone Hollow, a reputation for saying exactly what she meant and nothing she did not, and the specific authority of a woman whom everyone present had trusted at some point with something that mattered. She said that she had watched Rowena Voss work for the past several weeks with the attention of someone who knew what careful, competent, patient care looked like because she had needed it herself at various points in her life, and that what she had seen warranted not a community concern, but a community acknowledgement. Della Pruitt stood up next. She did not say very much. She said that her daughter's cough was gone and that she owed an apology to a woman who had helped without being asked to and without asking for anything in return, and that she was offering it now publicly because private apologies given after public doubts were insufficient. Rowena did not stand. She sat in her chair and let the room shift around her without trying to direct or accelerate it. She had learned over a long time of this kind of work that the moment a person made their case about themselves, they lost the ability to let the case make itself. The evidence was in the room. It was in the letter in Cormac's pocket, and in the words of the women who had stood, and in the simple, unadorned fact of what Jasper Bell looked like now compared to what he had looked like a month ago. She did not need to add anything to it. Finch remained at the front of the room. His expression had moved through several things during the course of the past 20 minutes, and what it had arrived at was not defeat, exactly, but something that Rowena recognized as more valuable. The particular look of a person confronting the distance between their intentions and their effects. It was an uncomfortable look. It was also, she thought, an honest one. He said, when the room had reached its natural pause, that he was grateful to the community for its willingness to engage in difficult conversations. He said this without his usual warmth, flatly and with effort, the voice of a man who was no longer performing, but simply speaking. He said that he had always acted in what he believed were the best interests of the people in his care, and that he was prepared to examine whether his judgment had been well placed in this particular matter. He did not apologize in the sweeping, formal way of a public figure managing a loss. He said quietly and to Cormac directly, "I should have listened when you asked questions. I made it easier for you not to ask them. That was wrong. It was enough. Not everything, but enough." Price had not attended the gathering. His absence was noted by everyone and explained by no one, which was its own kind of statement. By the following week, it became known that he had made arrangements to relocate, quietly, without fanfare, with the efficiency of a man who understood that a situation had moved past the point where his remaining in it was tenable. Rowena did not feel the satisfaction she might once have expected at this outcome. She felt instead the particular tiredness of a conflict resolved, not won, because she had never been interested in winning, only in the outcome for the child at the center of it. The day after the gathering, a wagon came up the road to Ashfield in the late morning, unexpected. Rowena was in the kitchen when she heard it, and she watched from the window as Cormac stepped off the porch to meet it. The driver was Finch. He came alone. He had left his formal coat at home, and he wore the plain, dark wool of a man on private business. No performance in it, no preparation for an audience. He climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone who had been sitting with a decision long enough that the sitting itself had worn him down, and he stood in the yard and spoke to Cormac with his hat in his hands. Rowena could not hear the words. She did not try to. She watched the shape of the conversation instead, the way Cormac stood without crossing his arms, which was the thing he did when he was willing to listen rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. She watched Finch's shoulders, which carried in them none of the ease she had always associated with him, the particular unhurried authority of a man who had spent years confident in his own rightness. What his shoulders carried now was different, the specific weight of someone who has picked up a truth and found it heavier than expected. After a time, Cormac turned toward the house and called her name. She came out onto the porch. Finch looked at her for a moment without speaking. The yard between them felt very open, very quiet, with the dry grass moving at the edges and the sky above enormous and pale. "I came to say something I should have said in that room," Finch said. His voice was even, unhurried, stripped of the warmth that had always been its primary instrument. "What I said to you on the boardwalk, about credentials, about the ground you were standing on, was designed to make you doubt yourself. I knew what I was doing when I said it. That was wrong, and I knew it was wrong. And I said it anyway, because I was afraid of what was true." Rowena looked at him. She had imagined this moment in the abstract way she imagined most possibilities, without letting herself invest in it, without building it into something she needed. The man in front of her was not the Finch she had constructed in those early weeks, the careful, polished, impenetrable authority. He was older than that, more ordinary. A man who had loved a community and a family within it and had managed that love with such complete confidence in his own vision that he had not, until now, allowed for the possibility that loving something and helping it were not always the same thing. "I know you loved that family," she said. Something moved through his face. "I did. I do." He paused, and in the pause she could see something working. Not calculation, but the harder, slower labor of a man remembering something he had not spoken aloud in a long time. "When Clara was dying, I sat with her. Cormac was outside. He was not able. He could not be in the room at the end. So I sat with her instead." Another pause, longer. "She asked me to look after Jasper, not Cormac. She knew Cormac would manage in his way. She asked me specifically to look after the boy, and I told her I would." "And so you did," Rowena said. "And so I did." His voice had gone very quiet. "I thought that was what I was doing, with Price, with the medicine. I believed, that a child in that kind of grief needed to be held still for a while, the way you hold a broken thing still while it knits. I was not thinking about whether what I was doing matched what she had asked of me. I was thinking about whether it matched my own understanding of what she had meant." He stopped. "Those are not the same thing." "No," Rowena said. "They are not. I got a great deal wrong." He held his hat in both hands, not performing humility, but carrying it the way you carry something you have just understood the weight of. I am not certain I know yet how much, but I know that I made it harder for this family to find their way through something they should have been allowed to find their way through on their own terms." He looked at Cormac. "I am sorry for that. I mean that plainly." Cormac looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. The same kind of nod he gave everything that mattered, single and final and without decoration. "I know you do," he said. Finch put his hat back on. He looked once more at Rowena, not with the warmth he had always deployed so precisely, not with the authority she had always felt him arranging around himself, but with something much simpler and considerably more valuable. The straightforward look of a man who has just seen someone clearly and is not sure how he missed it for so long. He climbed back into the wagon. He drove away down the road without looking back. Rowena stood on the porch and watched the dust settle and thought about the difference between a man who refused to examine himself and a man who had simply been looking in the wrong direction for a long time. She did not forgive him easily. She did not forgive him completely. But she filed away the part that was honest, because in her experience, the honest parts of complicated people were always worth keeping. Cormac came to stand beside her on the porch. He did not say anything for a while. That was harder for him than anything he said in the room last night. He said eventually, "Yes," she said. "It was." "Does it change anything?" She thought about it honestly. "It changes how I think about what happened. It does not change what happened." She paused. "But it is something." He nodded. They went back inside together. Greystone Hollow, for its part, moved on in the way small communities move on. Not all at once and not without remainder, but perceptibly in the direction of something more truthful than what had come before. Della Pruitt brought her daughter to Ashfield on a mild afternoon with a jar of apple butter as a quiet, unannounced offering, and the daughter spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with Jasper discussing, with great seriousness, the relative merits of different methods for pressing dried flowers, a subject about which Jasper had no particular opinion, but which he engaged with the attentive, generous interest of a child who understood that conversation was itself a kind of courtesy. Rowena watched them from the counter and felt something she recognized after a moment as ordinary contentment, not the relief of a crisis resolved or the satisfaction of a thing done, but the simpler, quieter pleasure of a room full of the right people doing an unremarkable thing without drama or difficulty. She had not had that in a long time. She had not known she missed it. The days that followed were quieter, not the strained quiet of the first weeks at Ashfield, the silence of people managing careful distance, but the settled quiet of a household that had arrived somewhere and was learning what it meant to be there. Jasper's recovery moved the way real recovery moves, in small, unglamorous increments, a better morning following a difficult evening, an appetite that grew gradually rather than all at once, a laugh that appeared more frequently and with less effort, as though it had remembered that it belonged there and was reclaiming its territory. He began leaving small things on the kitchen table for Rowena in the mornings. A stone he had found with an interesting shape, a drawing of a horse with anatomical labels in his own handwriting, not entirely accurate, which she corrected without comment by adding the right labels beside his wrong ones. Questions written on slips of paper. He had taken to this in the nights, leaving them folded for morning, that said things like, "If a person's heart is muscle, can it get stronger like other muscles? And does a body know when it is being helped? Or does it only know that things are different?" She answered each one in writing beneath his question and left it where he would find it. And the next morning, a new question appeared on a new slip of paper, and she understood that this was the beginning of something that would continue for a long time, a correspondence that would outlast its occasion and become its own kind of world. She answered them all. She kept every one. There was a morning, perhaps 2 weeks after the gathering, when Rowena came downstairs to find Jasper already at the kitchen table with a book open beside his breakfast. A book about the natural world, one of the few in the house that had pictures alongside the text, botanical illustrations in careful ink that showed the internal structure of plants the way her own diagrams showed the internal structure of people. He had a stub of pencil, and he was annotating the margins in his small, precise handwriting, adding his own observations alongside the printed ones. He did not look up when she came in. He was too absorbed. She stood at the counter and let the fire catch under the kettle and watched him in the way she watched everything she valued, quietly, without imposing herself on it, letting it be what it was rather than what she might have wanted it to be. He said without looking up, "Did you know a plant can be both medicine and poison, depending on how much you use?" "Yes," she said. "That's true of a lot of things, isn't it?" "Yes," she said again. "It is." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his annotations. Rowena turned to the stove and smiled at the wall where no one could see it, and the kettle began to sing. The recovery of Ashfield itself was quieter and harder to name than Jasper's. Rowena watched it the way she watched most things, without rushing to give it a word before she was certain the word was right. But it was there, in the texture of the days, in the way the house moved through its mornings and evenings, with a rhythm that was becoming gradually the rhythm of people who had survived something and were beginning to understand what came after survival. Cormac came in at the end of each day and washed at the pump and sat at the table and asked about Jasper's afternoon. And the question was no longer loaded with the particular weight of a man asking because he was afraid of the answer. He was asking because he wanted to know. There was a difference, and she felt it each time, and she did not remark upon it because some things were best allowed to accumulate without commentary. Marin came out to Ashfield on the second Sunday after the gathering, with no pretext this time. She simply came, and she brought preserved fruit from her back stores, and stayed through the afternoon, and talked with Rowena about everything and nothing in the easy way of people who have arrived at a friendship that does not need to be explained. She told Rowena, at one point, that several families in town had asked after her, not with the cautious curiosity of the first weeks, but with the simpler, more open interest of people reassessing what they had been told, and finding the original assessment wanting. Finch had not retracted anything he had said before the gathering, but he had also said nothing further. In Greystone Hollow, Marin said, that kind of silence from Reverend Finch was itself a statement. "People are watching to see what kind of woman you turn out to be," Marin said. "They've been watching since I stepped off the coach," Rowena said. "Yes, but they were watching to confirm something then. Now they're watching to find something out." A pause, and then Marin's particular brand of directness. "That's better." Rowena considered this and decided she agreed. On the evening of the first warm day that genuinely felt like the season was releasing its grip, she was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of tea when Cormac came and sat beside her. Not across from her, not at a considered distance. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, with the ease of a man who had stopped calculating the appropriate measure of proximity and was simply sitting where he wanted to sit. They were quiet for a while. The grassland below the house was beginning to show the first faint green of new growth at the bases of the dry stalks, and the air smelled of cold earth and something alive working its way up through it. The sky was enormous and clear and moving through its slow evening transformation, amber deepening toward the color of old copper. He said, "The door at the end of the hall." She looked at him. "Clara's things," he said. "Jasper and I were going to go through them. We've been putting it off for a long time." A pause. "He wants you there, when we do." She understood what was being offered, not the replacement of something. Nothing about Cormac Bell suggested a man who confused substitution for healing, but the inclusion of her in something that was his and Jasper's, the making room that was a different gesture than making welcome, quieter and more deliberate and more permanent. "I would be glad to be there," she said. He nodded. He looked at the grassland. His shoulder was warm against hers, and neither of them moved away. "The latch," he said. She waited. "On your door. You never installed it." She had not. She had noticed, some weeks into her time at Ashfield, that she had stopped thinking about it, that the need it was meant to address had quietly resolved itself without requiring the hardware. "No," she said. "Does that mean you feel safe here?" It was not quite a question. She answered it as though it were. "It means I stopped needing a lock between myself and the rest of the house." She paused. "Yes, that is what it means." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the lower register he used for the things that cost him something, "I don't know how to say," and stopped and started again differently. "You came here because you needed somewhere to go. I know that. And I needed someone for practical reasons. I know that too." He looked at her. "But what's here now is not that. I want you to know that I know the difference." She looked back at him. The light was going in the west, the sky moving through its slow transformation, and his face in that light was the face she had been watching for months. The face that had learned, slowly and at some cost, to let itself be seen. She thought about the locked wooden box and the long road west and the door she had walked through, not because she believed in second chances, but because it was open and she was not the kind of woman who stayed in hallways. She thought about a boy who left questions on slips of paper in the night, and a man who stood in dark hallways listening to the sounds his house made, and a kitchen that had begun, somewhere in the middle of all of it, to feel like hers. "I know you know the difference," she said. "That is why I am still here." The grassland moved in the evening wind, silver and new green together, old and living intertwined. Inside the house, from somewhere upstairs, they could hear Jasper moving through his room with the ordinary unhurried sounds of a child at the end of a day. A drawer opening, a book set down, the particular creak of a floorboard that Rowena knew by now meant he was crossing to the window to look at the sky before bed. She knew which floorboard. She knew the rhythm of his step. She knew the sound the back door made when Cormac came in at the end of the day, and the particular quality of silence the house kept after dark, when everyone in it was safe. She had not expected to know these things when she stepped off that coach. She had not expected to want to know them. Cormac's hand found hers on the step between them. He did not take it dramatically. He simply placed his hand over hers, warm and still, with the same quiet intention with which he did everything that mattered to him. She turned her hand and let their fingers settle together, and they sat like that in the cooling evening. The two of them, the house breathing behind them, the boy upstairs looking out at the enormous western sky from a window that was no longer dark. The wooden box was on the shelf in the kitchen, as it always was. The iron latch was still in its paper box on the table in her room. The door at the end of the hall was still closed, waiting for a morning when all three of them were ready to open it together. Some things could not be hurried. Some things were worth the waiting. It was not the life she had packed for. It was better than that. It was the life that had been here, waiting to be found by someone who knew how to look.